Are you an educator who questions why you don't see your administrators more? Or maybe why they're not as supportive of you and your instruction as you think they should be, or that you really want them to be? Or are you an administrator who maybe thinks that they want to be an instructional leader more than they're capable of, or that there are things that take you well away from what you really want to be doing, which is being an instructional leader? In this video, I'm going to show you how I came across some disturbing information about why we might need to rethink our concept of how school administrators are not instructional leaders. Hi, my name is Dr. Dan Kreines. I'm the host of the Leader of Learning podcast, and I have actually been in administrative positions twice in my educational career. But I consider myself to be more of an instructional leader, and so the information that I'm going to share in this video is both a little disturbing and kind of not so surprising. I want to really talk through with you why we might need to reconsider whether or not school administrators are true instructional leaders. To emphasize my point about this, I want to speak to some recent information, an article and some research that supports this idea. First, let me be upfront in telling you that the research shows that only 12% of a school administrator's time is actually being spent on instructional leadership. Believe it or not, that's what the research finds. And again, I'm disappointed, but I'm not terribly surprised. Let me tell you a little bit of a story about me before I share with you further research and the important data that speaks to this point. Earlier in this school year, actually, the 2021-2022 school year, I left my role as a digital learning coach in one district to become an assistant principal in another. But what I found was that my almost entire time that was being spent during school hours at least felt like I was doling out discipline and really being taken away from a lot of the responsibilities that I felt like I should have in supporting my staff, the teachers and the staff members who are working with students. And I just felt like I couldn't be the instructional leader that I wanted to be. I share a lot more about my story in a podcast episode that I did on why I resigned as an assistant principal. But ultimately, the biggest reason for making that decision and coming back into a role as an instructional coach is because I wanted to have a greater impact on instruction in my building. So let's talk about the research that I came across recently. First of all, I came across this somewhat disturbing article, and it talks about the research that was done. I came across the article in Huffington Post, but it was previously published in another publication, but it still speaks to the same research that was done. Let's take a look now at that research. Here's the study that both the Huffington Post article and Education Week, where it was originally published, referred to. This research and the article called Effective Instructional Time Use for School Leaders, Longitudinal Evidence from Observations of Principals was first conducted by Jason Grissom at Vanderbilt University in collaboration with Susanna Loeb and Ben Master at Stanford University. So here's the part of the article that was most disturbing or not so surprising, but clearly concerning, that school administrators, or specifically principals as the term that's used in this article, that 12% of their time is actually getting to be spent on instructional leadership, with 5.4% of that time being spent the most on classroom walkthroughs. Here in this chart, we can see the breakdown of the information sources about how these school principals are spending their quote-unquote instructional leadership time. Again, the most amount of time is being spent on unscheduled walkthroughs, and then you could see the breakdown of other ones. In this table, again, we can see that the total instructional time that's being used by principals across all the schools where this research was being conducted is 12.7%. Again, the highest amount of time is 5.4% that's being spent on classroom walkthroughs, and you can see on the left in that column under all schools, all years, how the rest of their time is being spent. 0.5% is spent on coaching teachers, 2.1% spent on developing the educational program, 1.8% on evaluating teachers, 0.6% on either required or non-required teacher PD or professional development, and then 2.4% on other instructional time use. And at the bottom there, you see where it says N of schools. That means the number. This study was conducted over 127 schools, and out of those 127 schools, it is determined that their principals are only spending 12.7% of their time on instructional leadership. Now again, the number 12.7% is certainly concerning because I think as classroom teachers, we want to know that our administrators have our backs, not just when it comes to student discipline, but also when it comes to our instruction as well. And if you look at that 5.4% of the time that's spent on classroom walkthroughs, then I'm of the opinion that those classroom walkthroughs should be evidence of that administrator, that principal, using their time wisely to be an instructional leader. But let's dive in a little bit further into the research that looks specifically at how principals are using these classroom walkthroughs. This table shows the categorization of responses and representative quotes from the research participants who were interviewed here in this study. And some of these I find to be pretty insightful. Let's take a look at the very topmost response. It says that in a very brief walk-in into the classroom, the principal is looking for evidence that curriculum is actually being adhered to in some form or fashion, and that the students and teacher are on task. If we skip down a little bit, this response says, I really need to be visible throughout my building throughout the day, and so I really make it a point and effort to be in those classrooms at least twice during the day. And again, just below it, we see another reference to the fact that this principal wants to be visible. It's incredibly important in being the instructional leader to be visible, visiting the classes. How else do you really know what's going on? And then again, in the final response, it's a little bit more about compliance. I can tell when something's going right in a classroom and when things aren't going right in a classroom. So to me, in these responses, what many of them are, I think, explaining is that their classroom walkthroughs and being visible in the school and in the classrooms is probably more about compliance than it is actually providing instructional leadership. Let's take a look back at the responses again. And underneath the category or the reason for walkthroughs of being visible and monitoring, we do come to a section on coaching, providing feedback about instruction, and connecting to resources. So here are some examples of what these principals say about how they spend their classroom walkthrough time on coaching, providing feedback, and connecting. First, I actually really like what this principal says about learning myself what's going on in the classroom as far as good instructional practices, at the same time providing feedback to the teachers on what good practices they're implementing. And then, of course, I love that this principal says that they recognize them and commend them on doing so. Another response says, I'm able to go into any classroom in this building and teach that lesson, diagnose what's wrong with that lesson, and then be able to tell the teacher, you really need to do this. This principle says when they check in on teachers on a daily basis, they're able to tell how they can provide assistance if we need to provide additional resources. Now, this principle goes so far as to say that it's not just about looking at the teacher, but also being able to look at the students and know whether they're getting it or not. And if not, to be able to talk to the teacher or plan any kind of professional development or intervention. And finally, in case I need to provide input, or if I see a teacher that's on the wrong page per se, I know that I can always redirect that individual. So that's what the research says. I showed you some pretty clear examples across 127 schools and principals that were studied here in this research that speak to the fact that classroom observations are the largest component of a principal's time spent as an instructional leader, and it's still only 5% of their time. Let me just read a little bit more about what this research says in terms of how principals are actually spending their time as instructional leaders. To summarize, the research says that the most common reasons given for conducting walkthroughs reflect a focus on monitoring teacher practices in order to gather information and be more visible to staff. For example, one principal described walkthroughs as a way to recognize in a very brief walk-in into the classroom that the curriculum is actually being adhered to in some form or fashion and that the students and teacher are on task. As I've already mentioned, to me, if principals are spending their walkthrough time doing this, honestly, shame on them, because this clearly seems like an opportunity for these principals to look for compliance and to either reward or maybe punish teachers and students who aren't being so compliant. Now, on the flip side, the article says that in contrast, a similar subset of the principals that were interviewed cited the opportunity to provide coaching or other support to teachers as a rationale for their walkthroughs. For example, as we saw, one of the principals described the purpose of the walkthroughs as in case I need to provide input or if I see that a teacher's on the wrong page per se, I know that I can always redirect that individual. And another described their approach as, quote, I'm able to go into any classroom in the building and teach that lesson, diagnose what's wrong with that lesson, and then be able to tell the teacher, you really need to do this. So honestly, kudos to those principals who are actually using walkthroughs as opportunities to not just gather evidence about compliance and not even gather evidence about teaching practices, but to gather the evidence so that they can actually provide feedback or provide direct coaching to that teacher if there's something that just doesn't quite add up. It just doesn't really jive with the school's approach to classroom instruction or classroom management, or maybe the district curricula that has been established for that content area. And then finally, the authors of this article say that overall, the differences in principals' reported rationales for conducting walkthroughs provides some suggestive evidence for why we find that walkthroughs are negatively associated with outcomes in some schools more than others. While most principals appear to conduct walkthroughs primarily for reasons of information gathering and visibility, others view walkthroughs as an opportunity to provide instructional support to staff. These differences may reflect not only a diversity of opinions about leadership practices, but also differences in principals' capacity to engage with teachers to improve their instructional execution. So what does this all mean? Well, at the beginning of the video, I told you a little bit of a story about how I was an assistant principal and I just felt like my time was being spent so much on other admin tasks and school operations and school discipline that I just didn't have the opportunity to really spend enough time in classrooms and spend making myself known to the staff as an instructional leader. And I was really concerned that everyone was just kind of using me as a disciplinarian. And so I kind of learned about myself that I enjoy opportunities to be in positions that really help me kind of flex my muscles as an instructional leader. So I think if you're a classroom teacher or other staff member at the school, your takeaways from this video might be to realize how little time your administrators actually can spend on supporting your instruction. And I'm really not making this video or saying that to bash administrators. I've been there, I've lived that life, and I realize how hard it is to really find that much time to be able to devote to being an instructional leader. But if you're a classroom teacher or another staff member and your administrator observes you, they walk through your classroom, whether it's a formal observation or not, I would encourage you to reach back out to them and make sure that you're understanding what their observation of your classroom was, what their interpretation of it was. Hopefully they're providing you feedback. Hopefully they're trying to find opportunities for themselves or maybe other instructional leaders in your school, like me as an instructional coach, to support you in areas that either they or preferably you feel like you need a little bit more support in, that you could really improve in. And I know that you might think that it's hard for me to give advice to other school administrators after I just admitted that I left a school administrative job because I was not finding the time that I wanted to be an instructional leader. But my biggest piece of advice to other school leaders and principals out there is to not just conduct classroom walkthroughs to be visible. Don't just look for compliance to check in on teachers and students to make sure they're doing the right thing, but really take the time, because you only have 12% of your time according to the research participants here. Take that time and really spend it wisely and value the little bit of time that you actually do get as a principal or assistant principal to be an instructional leader. When I got to my district as an assistant principal, I clearly and vividly remember the superintendent saying that your number one job is to improve instruction. I always took that with me, and I took it to heart to mean that regardless of all of the endless list of tasks and administrative duties that we needed to accomplish every day, at the heart of all of that was helping teachers and, of course, students succeed in the classroom and succeed academically. Anyway, I really hope that this video has been educational and informational and hopefully inspirational as well for both classroom teachers and other school staff, and certainly for school leaders and administrators. If you have feelings either way about this topic, please share them in the comments below. Maybe you support and agree with the fact that this research obviously found that only a little bit of time that principals are using during their day is spent on being an instructional leader. But maybe you want to push back and maybe you want to argue against that fact. Maybe you yourself are an administrator or school principal and you have found ways to be a more effective instructional leader, spend more time in classrooms, be visible without just looking for compliance. I want to know that as well. Definitely comment down below in this video, but also I would love it if you would reach out to me. DM me on social media at Dr_Kreines. Email me at dan@leaderoflearning.com and let me know, because if this research got it wrong, then 127 principals who said that they only spend 12% of their time on instructional leadership may be wrong too. And I'd love to know from you if that's the case. Anyway, for more of the great content that I share both on this YouTube channel and through my podcast, Leader of Learning, you can always head to leaderoflearning.com. And if you want some of the great free content that I share, you can sign up for my email newsletter at leaderoflearning.com/news to receive either one or both of a free guide that I offer to educators and leaders on how to build trust as an instructional leader, or my ebook on transforming education one mindset at a time. Thanks so much for watching, and don't forget to comment down below and also like and subscribe to this video and to this channel if you love the content that I'm sharing, and so that you get more in the future. Thanks.